Food critic Kelly von Hemert is paid to be judgmental. Tasting food and evaluating ambiance in hundreds of different restaurants, Kelly's opinions can make the difference between success and failure for a culinary establishment. How does she get the information she needs to form her judgments?
Enjoy it.
Through sensation and perception. The world we live in is filled with information for our senses to take in. We see light. We hear sounds. We feel cold. We taste sweetness. And we smell aromas. Our ability to experience environmental stimuli is called sensation. Taken together, these stimuli create a unique experience for each and every individual of what it means to be human. What would life be like without sensations? In a word, lifeless. We receive information from our environment through our senses of vision, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. The process begins with our sensory receptors.
Sensory receptors are specialized nerve cells. They're the first stage in the information processing change. And essentially what they're doing is they have the function of transduction, which is a translation between the language of the physical world, the language of light and sound, into the language of the nervous system, which is electrical activity. Something has to act as a go-between because the nervous system does not understand light, it does not understand sound. So the sensory receptors, these very specialized cells, transform one sort of information into another. It's a recoding. There's no loss of information. It's just a translation into a different language.
A little bit of zucchini blossoms.
When information is successfully received into our bodies, we experience sensations. Things like odors and taste. The process is so natural for us that we don't even have to think about it. And yet a closer look reveals the complex processes our nervous system must go through in order to achieve this basic function.
Your food critic is at a Mexican restaurant and is about to eat something that's got chili pepper in it. The first thing you think about when someone puts food in their mouth is the distinction first between taste and smell. That may sound strange because you think of smell as something you do from a distance, but in fact the nose has two biological functions. One of them is to sniff things from a distance, and your food critic has sniffed food coming into the restaurant. But the second, and the function that most people don't quite appreciate, is that when you put food in your mouth and you chew and swallow it, you pump the odors of the food behind your palate into the nasal cavity. And so your nose constantly is barraging your brain with information about the odors that are in your mouth. And you're using that information to identify food.
When we consume food, odor molecules are inhaled through the nose or mouth and travel to the top of the nasal cavity. Here they stimulate olfactory receptors. At the same time, food particles on the tongue stimulate receptors in the mouth, called taste buds. When these receptor cells are activated, they transmit raw sensory data to the brain along appropriate neural pathways. Somewhere along the line, the information is integrated, organized, and interpreted in a meaningful way. This is what psychologists refer to as perception.
For example, sensation might be the raw sense of colors that you see. Perception might be seeing things like tables, chairs, objects, cars, trees, higher level perceptual data that you get from it. In hearing, sensations might be the raw sense of sounds. Perception might be hearing that it's a trumpet or hearing that it's a saxophone. Without consciously having to figure it out, you just hear that it is a saxophone, for example. In taste, perceptions might be, the raw sensations might be, you know, sour, bitter, salty, and sweet, but the perceptions might be that this is, you know, a Chianti or something like that. So it would be a higher level of perceptual awareness.
Early researchers were the ones who created categories that draw the line between sensation and perception. But in the last half of the 20th century, the distinction began to disappear. Today, psychologists disagree on whether there is a difference or if they're one and the same.
It used to be thought that sensations were uninterpreted. These were the givens in perception that didn't require any background or insight or interpretive processes on the part of the perceiver. And from that foundation, you would then go on to the more risky parts of perception, figuring things out. Now it's not clear that even things as elementary as, you know, color patches are raw and given and uninterpreted. It seems more likely that they themselves, color patches, are interpreted, very sophisticated interpretations. So the difference between sensation and perception is now not as clear.
I tend to think of the two as really the same. If you can sense something, you have to be able to perceive it, and vice versa. The mechanisms which are doing the sensing are also extracting information which is forming perceptions. So the perceptual processing is taking place at the same time in the same exact mechanisms that the sensing ability is taking place. So why separate them?
Why indeed? As a food critic, Kelly von Hemert uses her senses to gather the information she needs to write a review. And yet she, like most people, never stops to think about where sensation ends and perception begins.
When I walk in, I love to see an open kitchen. That's really huge right now because there's nothing to hide there, and you could see them prepping everything and whatever's going on back there, dirty dishes or whatever, it's all on display. Yeah, I definitely notice the noise level of a restaurant, and hopefully that's appropriate for the type of restaurant. If you are planning on going out and having a happening Cinco de Mayo, you don't want to walk in and just hear these sounds of crickets in the corners and nothing else is going on. I think there's definitely the potential for a meal being better when it's in balance as far as your salty, sweet, bitter, those kinds of tastes. You definitely never want a meal that tastes flat. Your tongue's divided into all of these sections and everything, and I don't think anyone's really thinking, over on the left side I'm tasting this, but it's that overall mouthfeel and that overall flavor that your brain's getting the message, and you know, as well as I do, when it's a winner.
The difference between sensation and perception may be indiscernible, but experts agree that there is a clear separation between perception and judgment.
The difference between a perception and a judgment is that a perception is something that you get unconsciously. You don't have to consciously worry about what's going on in the process of perception. I see a tiger, it just leaps out at me that I see a tiger. I don't have to do any conscious work for that. Judgment is typically thought of as something more like a conscious perception. I see two lines, they're pretty close together in length, and I have to judge which one's the longer. I'm going to look, I'm going to scrutinize, and then give it some conscious decision-making to make that judgment. So judgment tends to involve a more conscious aspect. Perception seems to be what you get for free, but it's yet sophisticated, an unconscious effort.
Considering the key role sensation and perception play in our lives, humans are fortunate that these processes come so easy, because without them, we could not survive.
Our perceptual systems are adapted to allow us to see the depth of the world around us so we don't fall off cliffs. We have color perception so we can see the color of fruit, see the color of things around us so that we can identify them and know whether they're friend or foe, something that we can eat or something we should run from, whether it's a mate or an enemy. Perception is also critical because we get information from perception, for example, about the intentions of other people. I can look at your face, tell whether you're interested, angry, bored. I can tell your race, your mood, your sex, your age. I get a lot of useful information from perception.
The function of taste and smell for survival of the species is a fascinating question. My own view is that taste is the true nutritional sense that solves immediate problems that if you don't solve, you die. Let me give you an example. If you were deficient in salt, let's say you had been sweating a great deal, if you don't replace the salt again, losing a great deal of salt in your body is death. So you have to replace it quickly. What do we have? Brain mechanisms that are virtually automatic. If you need salt, you're going to want it. And in fact, you can even show in rats who've never specifically been trained to do this, that when they are put into sodium need, they know what they need, and if they've ever experienced salt, they will go to the place where the salt was. Now, what about olfaction? Olfaction is the cue that helps you learn about a food based on what the food did for you the last time you consumed it. Olfaction, in fact, I think is like a sensory labeling system. If you have a positive experience associated with an odor, that odor becomes liked. If you have a negative experience, it's disliked. Have you ever been to a party where you've gotten sick on something and never wanted to touch it again? That is a mechanism left over from an era of poisoning. That is, your brain has a mechanism to make you instantly regard something that has been associated with nausea as disgusting, so you won't take it in again.
We form perceptions in one of two ways. The first method is called bottom-up processing.
Bottom-up processing we could think of in terms of a Christmas tree. If you start off with the raw tree and then start hanging ornaments on it, as you hang more and more ornaments on the tree, it gets closer and closer to what we mean, in our culture at least, as a Christmas tree, until you put the star on top and now you have a Christmas tree. That would be bottom-up processing.
The other method of analyzing sensory information starts with the whole object and moves to the individual parts. It's called top-down processing, and it uses our knowledge and expectations to arrive at meaningful perceptions. For example, if you were unfamiliar with the ways in which many people celebrate Christmas, you might think of this as just an oddly decorated pine tree. But with appropriate knowledge, you are able to assign meaning to what you see and call it a Christmas tree. Interestingly enough, the same processes that help us make sense of the real world
you're probably noticing, wow, there's a lot of purple and green here.
are also at work in the imaginary world of virtual reality.
Virtual reality works by using all of our natural propensity to try to construct a world very actively from the data that our senses receive. So normally, we'll receive visual data in both of our eyes, we'll receive auditory data in our ears, and we'll feel things and we'll smell things. It isn't as though that is enough to have the world. We've actually got to be far more creative to take that information and to make a three-dimensional world with sights, sounds, and smells, our friends, other people, other animals, other creatures. It's a very active process of perception. So we can use a computer monitor to present visual stimuli. We can use headphones to create sounds. We can use one of these virtual smell devices, and we will create a world, a three-dimensional living world that goes along with all of those inputs.
Finding your way in a virtual environment, just as in the real world, involves bottom-up and top-down processing. For example, if you were asked to find